Hello everybody, welcome to week 6 of the course. We're over 1/3 of the way now, so we're making some progress. Hope everybody's semester is going well. Last week we had a quiz. I noticed several people didn't take the quiz, so if you guys had a legitimate reason for not taking the quiz, shoot me an email and we'll see if we can work something out. Anyway, okay, so last week, right, we were talking about happiness, right, and we found out that Aristotle's definition of what happiness isn't necessarily the same as we typically think about happiness. So the reading that I had you guys read was from a book by Aristotle called the Nicomachean Ethics. Just a piece of trivia, it's called the Nicomachean Ethics because Aristotle's son was named Nicomachus, so sort of a tribute to his son. But in that book, Aristotle is trying to provide an ethical account of what it means for human beings to live the good life, right? So what does it mean to live the good life? But before Aristotle can lay out, his plan, his schema of what it means to live, how you go about living a good life, he has to figure out what a good life for human beings look like, right? And that's what takes him down this road of happiness that we read about last week. And it's important, so there's an issue in translation, and I know some people who had studied this stuff before mentioned this in the discussions. There's an issue in translation, right? Because the word that is translated in our language as happiness, in Greek is called eudaimonia. And the literal translation of that means with good spirit, right? So eu is a prefix that means good in Greek, and daimon is like demon, right? When demon meant spirit, right? So doing something with a good spirit. Oftentimes, another alternate translations besides happiness for eudaimonia are things like human flourishing, right? What does it mean to be the greatest human being that you can be, right? When you're doing everything the way that you should be doing it in your life, you achieve this state of eudaimonia, right? Which is not usually what how we describe happiness, right? Now we certainly understand Aristotle's point that happiness is like the ultimate end of our activities, right? Because you ask people what they want, right? What do you want? You want to find a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband, a wife. But you have to ask yourself the further question: why do I want those things? Because I think they'll make me happy, right? So his point about happiness being sort of the ultimate end makes a lot of sense. But his notion of happiness is quite different than ours, right? So remember, he's trying to provide this account of what the good looks like for human beings, right? So Aristotle, he's a very rational, very logical guy. He approaches this in, almost, he's sort of like the model. He actually, as a matter of fact, he invented modern logic, right? Or classical logic anyway. So he starts out by saying, okay, we want to know what's good for human beings, right? Well, first we have to figure out what human beings are and what human beings actually do, right? And this is something that's known, that he uses, called the function argument, right? What are the functions of things? And this is the function argument is not necessarily here, but he's using it here. It initially occurred in his Politics, which we're reading this week, but we're not going to be reading function argument. Anyway, sorry. So the function argument, right? You determine whether something is good or not based on the purpose of that thing, right? So what does it mean for something to be a good knife? It means that it's sharp and that it cuts well, right? And that's its virtue. A knife is virtue, and this is sort of an odd thing, but inanimate objects can actually be virtuous according to Aristotle's account of virtue. Right, so for a knife to be virtuous, it has to be a sharp knife, right? For a horse to be virtuous, it has to be fast and be able to carry weight, whatever we think the purpose of a horse actually is. So that leaves Aristotle to ask this question: well, if a knife has a purpose, a very common example that you hear him using, this is actually the example that he uses when he's talking about function, is the eye, right? The human eye. What is the purpose of the human eye? To see well, right? So you have a virtuous eye, if you can see well. As you can see, my eyes are not so virtuous, but they're corrected. So his argument is, surely if the eye has a purpose, surely if the nose has a purpose, then human beings themselves actually have a purpose, right? So he says, well, okay, how do we figure out what the purpose of human beings are? Well, we have to differentiate ourselves. We can't just say because we're alive, right? Because plants are alive, animals alive. It can't be just because we're somewhat self-aware and we have, we experience feelings and sensations, because he says animals do that. So what is it that separates human beings from animals and other life forms? And according to Aristotle, it's our ability to reason, our ability to think logically about things. So if you follow along with Aristotle's function argument, right, that a virtuous thing is whatever the characteristic of that thing is, doing it well, right? So if our characteristic as human beings, the thing that separates us from other entities, is our ability to think rationally, then what makes us a good human being, according to Aristotle, is the ability to reason well, right? So that's sort of the notion of virtue that he has, right? So, how does he get from that to this notion of happiness, right? So on one hand, we have this argument that says, the greatest good that we can pursue is something that is pursued in and of itself, not something that we pursue for a higher goal, right? Because let's say we want to make money, right? That's our goal, right? It's a lot of people's goal. I want to make money. Yeah, but why do you want to make money? Well, I want to make money so I can be happy, right? Aristotle says happiness is not like that, right? Happiness is something that you do for its own sake. You don't do it because you want to be happy. You don't fall in love. Maybe, even he says even falling in love is something that you do because you want to be happy, right? But you don't want to be happy because of something else, right? Happiness is sort of the end point. That's the thing that human beings, or maybe it's better for us to say human flourishing or eudaimonia is what we're striving for, doing the best that we possibly can, right? So we have that as our chief good, right? And then we have this sort of argument about the function of human beings, right, being to reason well. So if this notion of virtue for human beings is tied into this notion of reasoning well, and what we're trying to achieve by doing that is this sort of human flourishing, that's how he ends up equating the notion of virtue and the virtues, which the rest of the ethics, the book, the Nicomachean Ethics, is all about laying out the different kinds of virtues that human beings have. And if you want to achieve this state of eudaimonia, you need to sort of possess and that's another important thing to say about happiness for Aristotle, is that it's not just possessing things. Being an honest person is not enough for Aristotle, because Aristotle says that it has to be activity, right? So it's activities that you're carrying out rationally thinking, right? So it's not enough just to be honest. You have to actually tell the truth, right? It's not enough to be generous. You actually have to go out and commit acts of charity, right? So that's how we achieve this notion of eudaimonia or happiness according to Aristotle, right? And this is very different, than our modern conception of happiness, right? So maybe if we make this distinction between human flourishing and being a successful human being, right, maybe we could get on board with Aristotle's argument. But if we're talking about happiness, a lot of us think we're happy, like, I just had a baby, and when I see my daughter, it makes me happy, right? But what am I really saying when I'm saying that it makes me happy? I'm saying that it gives me pleasure, right? I don't know any other way to say it. I was going to say it makes me happy, right? But it gives me pleasure to see my daughter happy, and makes me kind of feel nice and warm inside, right? And Aristotle, he concedes that, as human beings, we're not just sort of, individual atoms floating around in our own sort of stratosphere. He says, human beings, this is one of his most famous quotes, human beings are social animals, or sometimes it's translated as political animals, right? So we don't operate individually, we operate in communities, right? So when he's talking about this notion of happiness being self-sufficient, he doesn't mean, it's just me against the world, and, all I need is happiness, right? Because he says this includes things like your family and your friends, children and things like that. So for Aristotle, happiness is in a lot of ways a communal thing, right? Because it's impossible to carry out these virtues that he lays out later in the book just by yourself, right? Because it requires some sort of interaction between individuals. And there's a point in the passage that I gave you guys to read where Aristotle talks about political science and the purpose of political science. And he says that once we figure out whatever this greatest good is for human beings, which in this case is this eudaimonia, or human flourishing, the purpose of political science is to create a state that's going to encourage that kind of good, right? So they're going to create citizens who meet this criteria of human flourishing, right? And they're going to put laws and things like that into place to make sure that the greatest good for humanity is actually being achieved. And whether that actually happens or not is often a debatable question. But anyway, that's the way Aristotle saw it, and that's why he thought that political science was the most important science, was because political science controls all the other sciences in society. So where was I going with that? Something else that he says, right, is that we don't really want to call somebody happy if they've had, a string of bad luck in their lives, right? So the example he gives is from the Iliad. The king of Troy, Priam was his name, lost both of his sons, right? Hector was killed by Achilles, and Paris, he ended up escaping, right? But he ended up dying as well. And Priam saw he saw Troy being burned to the ground by the Greeks. And, even though Priam sort of lived his life in accordance with virtue, was a very virtuous person, you still don't really want to call him happy, right? Because the external circumstances didn't match up, right? And he said that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not living his life well. He said that they're not living a blessed life, right? So their external circumstances are not adding up in such a way that even though they're doing things right, you still don't want to give them this mantle of human flourishing, because they're not flourishing, right? It's very hard to flourish if your children have been killed and your house has been burned to the ground, right? But he also talks about we have the need to have a certain amount, because remember, eudaimonia, or happiness, is an activity. It's not a state of affairs, right? It's not a state of mind. It's something that you actually go out and do while you're in a particular state of mind. And to go out and take actions, you have to have resources, right? So he says you at least need to have adequate external resources, adequate money, a house, in our society probably a car, a computer, things like that. If you don't have those things, you can't actually go out and do virtuous things, right? So there is a component of external goods for it, right? But it is primarily an internal thing, right? Let's see, what else? If you want to see sort of how he actually reasons his way to this point, because it's tricky, right? And I mean, that's something to say, is that Aristotle is not an easy read, right? And if you think you read it and you think you understood it, you probably missed something, right? Because you're going to have to go back to it and read it very carefully. But there is sort of, let me see if I can actually pull up this page that he makes this argument on, because it's really important, where he actually lays out how do we get from this notion of the function of human beings to happiness. Let's see. Okay, so it's on page 12 of our reading, right? It's the second paragraph of page 12 of our reading, right, where he starts with, if the characteristic of activity of a human being is an activity of the soul in accordance with reason. So he's just laying out all these definitions. This is where he's making sort of his deductive argument. He says, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. And that's how he ultimately gets to sort of his his definition of what virtue and happiness actually is. So, you may not disagree, you may not agree with where he ends up, but if you follow his reasoning in that sort of second paragraph on page 12, you'll see that his logic is pretty clear, right? Now, we may not agree with some of his terms, with happiness and virtue and things like that, and that of course is the big question, right? I mean, we have a sense of what virtue generally is, sort of this notion of reasoning well in accordance with the virtues, but from this reading, you don't know what the virtues actually are, right? The different virtues. So if you really want to dig into this and have a better understanding of what he's talking about when he's talking about acting in accordance with the virtues, you need to look at the theory of virtues that he lays out on the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics. For Aristotle, virtue is often the mean between two extremes, right? You guys may have heard this, right? So let's say we're looking at courage as a virtue, right? So on one hand, you have cowardice. On the other hand, you have recklessness, right? So for Aristotle, the virtue is somewhere in the middle between recklessness and cowardice, right? So for Aristotle, the virtue is sort of always in the middle between these two extremes. Anyway, that's how he defines that. Let's see what else. He talks about, and this was a little confusing to some people, right? He says that there are three types of goods. There are external goods, which are like, wealth, right, and material possessions and things like that. There are goods of the soul, right, and then there are goods of the body, which could be like, pleasure and things like that, right, food, etc. And he actually classifies happiness or eudaimonia as something that is a good of the soul. Right? So it's not material possessions, it's not pleasure, it's something that's actually happening in your soul, right? So the ultimate end for human beings, the ultimate happiness, is a good of the soul. He does talk about pleasure some a bit, right? And he says that for the virtuous and for the noble person, pleasure is actually acting in accord with the virtues. Now, this doesn't mean that happiness breaks down to doing whatever you like to do, right? So let's say that I like to hike or I like to swim, right? So the way that I become happy, according to Aristotle, is by swimming. Well, that's not true, right? Aristotle is just making the argument that for the virtuous person, for the honest person, right, telling the truth gives them pleasure. So it's not the case that doing these virtuous things is not going to bring you pleasure, because it does. And in fact, he makes the argument that for a virtuous person and for human beings in general, the most pleasurable thing that you can do is live your life in accordance with these particular virtues. Now, this brings up some interesting questions, right? Because we live in a multicultural society where people have very different conceptions of what the good life actually looks like, right? And that's one of the things that's great about our country, right? For the most part, you can do and pursue whatever it is that makes you happy, right? Going back to this notion of the pursuit of happiness that's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Aristotle didn't exactly believe that, right? I mean, he thought that these things could bring you, certain types of fleeting pleasures. But Aristotle believed that human beings are primarily very similar, right? Our form of life is universal across human nature. Even though one person might enjoy reading, one person might enjoy swimming or wrestling or whatever, the things that make us human are fundamentally the same. And that goes back to his notion of the function argument, right? The thing that sets us apart, that makes us unique as human beings, is our ability to think rationally and critically. So he's coming from a different perspective than a lot of us come from, right? So he has a very universal perspective of what human beings actually are and what human beings are doing. So it's important to keep in mind. He does concede that if anything is divinely granted, it would seem that the sort of the greatest good that human beings can achieve would be coming from the gods, right? So he says that he's not pursuing a religious account of happiness. He's trying to lay it out in rational and humanistic terms. But he says surely if there are any goods that would come from the gods, it would be this notion of justice and being noble. Yeah, I think that's it for this week, right? So it's sort of a complicated reading. There's a lot going on there. I'm not doing justice to all these ideas. I'm just trying to sort of introduce you guys to these ideas. If you have any questions about, what a virtuous life looks like to Aristotle and why happiness is a life that's lived in accordance with the virtues, and remember that happiness isn't necessarily happiness, right? At least not in the way that we think of it. Happiness is being a successful human being, being a good human being. That's what happiness was for Aristotle. Okay, so I know you guys are probably not excited to hear this, but we're reading more Aristotle this week. Rather than looking at his Nicomachean Ethics, we're going to be looking at in his Politics, and we're going to be looking at the ideal forms of government, right? The different forms of political constitutions that are available to people, and what Aristotle thinks are the ideals, right? So there are three types, and he thinks that there are three good types,